Hello everybody, welcome back to Dr. Police Yogato's Guide to Biostatistics and Epidemiology for medical board exams, as well as random trivia on cats. This is a high-yield simplified crash course in evidence-based medicine for your medical board exams such as PLAB, USMLE, AKT, MRCP, etc. For the full course, please visit the website shown here at drpoliziogato.thinkific.com. And you can watch a few more videos that I have uploaded onto this channel to see what the course is like. And if you want just the ebook, you can see the link here. All right, and to contact me, this is my email, drpoliziogato, one word, @gmail.com. All right, so let's talk about power, type 1 and type 2 error as part of this free sample video of the course. In our last video, we had talked about hypothesis testing, p-values, as well as confidence interval. So I'd highly recommend you watch that video first before coming to this one, because they are interrelated. Fine. So what exactly is a type 1 error and a type 2 error? So a type 1 error occurs when we reject the null hypothesis, even though it is true. Essentially, making a false claim. Right? For example, a drug actually does not lower blood pressure, but the trial shows a statistically significant effect by random chance. All right, so what does this mean? Remember, you're going to have your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis. Your alternative hypothesis is the study that you're trying to do, right? For example, in your study, you think drug X lowers blood pressure. So this is your alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is just opposite of this, meaning drug X has no effect on blood pressure. All right. Now, say we reject the null hypothesis, meaning, and we accept our alternative hypothesis, meaning we say our drug X lowers blood pressure. We conclude this from our study, but in reality, it does not work. So our study showed drug works. In reality, does not work. What we have done here is we have made a type 1 error. Okay, and so type 2 error is just the opposite, where we conclude that from the study that we have done, that the drug does not work, but in reality it does work. All right, so essentially what we have done in a type 2 error is a missed opportunity. Right, because the drug in reality does work, but we have concluded that it does not work based on our study. Maybe our sample size was too small, or our effect size was too small, it just wasn't well powered enough, etc. We'll talk a bit about this in the next slide. So essentially, type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis. So if you look up here, rejecting the null hypothesis, even though it's true, while a type 2 error is failing to reject the null hypothesis when it is false. Essentially, accepting the null hypothesis when it's actually false. Again, for the example, concluding that the drug does not work, but the trial shows a statistically significant effect, right? So essentially what you're saying here is the drug works, but what you're concluding is your drug works in your test, but in reality it does not work. And the opposite, meaning if you conclude that your drug does not work, meaning you're accepting your null hypothesis, but in reality it does work, meaning what you've done is you've got a missed opportunity there, right? Not finding a difference that is actually there. That's a type 2 error. All right, so watch this video maybe another time just to understand the difference. Again, it takes maybe a couple of times to get this concept right, but once you've got it, you've got it. And then this third thing we're going to talk about is power. So power is the probability of correctly rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false. Essentially, how confident you are that what you have concluded is true. And generally speaking, for most studies, you want the power to be 80%. All right. And it is given by the equation 1 minus type 2 error. So alpha error is also the type 1 error. and beta error is also called a type 2 error. And power is given by the equation 1 minus beta, or type 2 error. Okay, and generally anything above 80% is considered a well-powered study. It is the ability to detect a true difference when it exists. All right. So this 2x2 table here, this comes sometimes in exams and they ask you to fill in the blanks, but it helps to consolidate this concept. So if you look at the top here, we've got null hypothesis true, null hypothesis false, and then here reject null hypothesis or fail to reject null hypothesis. Essentially, fail, reject, null, that's like 3 negatives. Let's just keep it simple and call this one accept null hypothesis, right? I'll call it that. Now, suppose the null hypothesis is true, all right, and we reject the null hypothesis. That's called a type 1 error. Okay, so this is reality, and then this is study. Okay, or let's call it study, test, whatever you want to call this. Okay, so remember, again, drug X works. This is what we're trying to prove. Okay, so this is what our study is, our alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is just the opposite of this, so meaning drug X does not work. Right, so if the null hypothesis is true, meaning the drug X does not work, okay, but then we reject it and we conclude that the drug X actually works, when in reality it does not work, we've made a type 1 error. Right, so the null hypothesis, the reality is it does not work, but we reject this and we say it does work. That's called a type 1 error. What if the null hypothesis is true and we accept the null hypothesis, meaning the drug X does not work, and we conclude from our study that yes, actually it does not work, we've accepted it. That's called a true negative, a correct acceptance, a correct conclusion. On the other hand, if our null hypothesis is false, meaning our drug X works, right? If a null hypothesis is false, so remember, the null hypothesis is the opposite of what we're trying to prove. If you're trying to prove that the drug X works, the null hypothesis is that drug X does not work. So suppose in reality, drug X does work, all right, and we reject the null hypothesis. That's a true positive, right? It's a true conclusion. If on the other hand, the null hypothesis is false and we accept the null hypothesis, that's a type 2 error, meaning the drug works, but then we, instead of concluding the drug works, we conclude that actually it does not work. Right, so reality, drug works, study showing drug does not work. That's called a false negative, also known as a missed opportunity. Right, essentially the same thing we talked about in the last slide, but just consolidating it here. So again, alpha error, type 1 error, rejecting true null, beta error, probability of a type 2 error, meaning failing to reject a false null hypothesis, and power is the 1 minus beta, probability of correctly rejecting a false null hypothesis. Remember this equation, 1 minus type 2 error or 1 minus beta will give you power, and anything greater than 80% generally is considered good for your study, to say it is well powered. So look out for this if you're analyzing or critiquing a study. Fine. How do you increase power in a study, right? How do you actually detect the difference if it actually exists? So three main things that you need to be aware about. One is increasing sample size, right? The bigger the sample size, the more likely you are to find a true difference. So it's straightforward. Doubling participants from 100 to 200 improves the detection of a drug effect on blood pressure, right? More data reduces random error and narrows the confidence interval. So if we go back to the previous lecture where we talk about p-values and confidence intervals, we say the narrower the confidence interval, the more accurate it is, the more precise it is. Fine, so that's the first thing you can do, increasing sample size. Second thing you can do is reduce variability, essentially using accurate tools. For example, using standardized blood pressure cuffs, calibrating it regularly, using the same brand throughout. This ensures consistency throughout your data collection. So that's reducing variability. And the third thing is increasing effect size. Basically, if you're trying to detect something that's bigger, it's easier to find. For example, if you're trying to detect a drug that lowers blood pressure by 15 millimeters of mercury, it's easier to detect that than if you're trying to detect 3 millimeters of mercury, right? So increasing power, 3 things you can do: increase sample size, reduce variability, and increase the effect size. Fine, let's look at this example. Researchers conclude the medication is effective, but it actually has no effect, right? So in the real world, it doesn't work, but our study concluded that it works. That's a definition of a type 1 error, right? Researchers conclude the medication is not effective, right? But it actually lowers blood pressure. So reality means drug works, but we've concluded that the drug does not work from our study, meaning we failed to reject our null hypothesis. That is a type 2 error. And then just increasing power. Remember, we talked about increasing sample size, increasing the effect size, and reducing variability. All right. Yeah, I think that's the end of this chapter. And the star cat of this chapter is the American bobtail cat. So the American bobtail is characteristic because of its tail. So it's got this short bobtail due to a genetic mutation, and this is just about a third of the body length of the cat. It's often compared to the lynx because of its ears, its large eyes, and its shaggy coat. But despite how they look, they're very gentle, affectionate, and almost dog-like in their behavior. They can even play fetch. Very calm cats, so they adapt well to new environments, and so they're very good for people who travel a lot, or to be used in therapy settings to calm down cats. Actually, I think any cat will calm you down. No, maybe not every cat, maybe not orange cats. Crazy. Anyway, all right guys, thank you, and see you in the next video. Bye.